I sat there in front of my father's grave, still wearing the same stiff black suit, as though the fabric were the only thing holding my body together. I am Marcus Wood, 35 years old, a financial forensic examiner in St. Louis, Missouri, a job that demands cold precision. But right now, everything inside me was nothing but a vast, echoing void. My father, Alan Wood, had died suddenly of a heart attack, and the grief hit like a silent tidal wave, sweeping away every defense and leaving me gasping in emptiness. The cemetery stretched wide and cold around me, rows of stone markers standing like sentinels. Everyone else had already left the funeral. I was the last one alone with the chill wind and the rustle of dead leaves that sounded almost like whispers from the grave. My body felt drained, hollowed out. I'd cried every tear I had during the service, and now only numbness remained. The pain hadn't even begun to settle into memory when my phone vibrated in my pocket. An unknown number. A man's voice came through, urgent and trembling, as if he were fighting to keep fear from spilling over. "Hello, Mr. Marcus. This is Victor Haynes, your father Alan Wood's personal attorney. You need to come to my office immediately, as soon as you possibly can. Come alone and do not tell anyone. Your life may be in danger." My heart clenched. Danger? What are you talking about? My father just died. Why are you calling me now? What the hell is going on? But Victor didn't answer. He only repeated, voice shaking harder. "Come alone, Marcus. Tell no one. My office is downtown. Hurry!" Then the line went dead abruptly, as if someone had cut it. I stared at the screen, pulse hammering. Confusion, fear, and a strange, inexplicable curiosity surged through me. Like this call was the key to a secret I had never suspected existed. I stood up on legs that felt like lead, started the car, and pulled away from the cemetery. St. Louis appeared before me in shades of gray under a light afternoon rain. Skyscrapers blurred behind curtains of mist, wet streets reflecting headlights in dull smears. My mood grew heavier, crushed beneath black clouds. And then the memories of my father's final weeks came flooding back, uninvited, like an old film running in reverse. I remembered how unusually quiet he had become, not at all like the warm, joking man I'd grown up with. He would sit alone in the living room staring out the window. Whenever I walked in, he'd look at me for a long time, eyes heavy with something unspoken. "Dad, what's wrong?" I'd asked more than once. He only shook his head and gave a sad little smile. "Nothing, son. Just getting old, thinking too much." A few days before he died, during one quiet evening, he suddenly brought up money and betrayal. We were sitting at the dinner, just the two of us, and he looked straight at me, voice low. "Marcus, if one day you're betrayed by the people closest to you by blood, can a person ever truly forgive that?" The question stunned me. "What are you talking about? Who betrayed whom?" He only sighed and changed the subject to the weather, as if he'd never spoken. I remember our last dinner vividly. Late in the evening, his favorite grilled steak. Several times he started to say something, lips moving, eyes full of regret, but each time he fell silent. He only sighed again and asked about my work. "You're keeping yourself too busy, aren't you? Don't let the job swallow you whole." I laughed it off then, thinking it was just ordinary fatherly worry. Now I realize those were veiled farewells. Even his medical file had bothered me from the start. He'd been diagnosed with moderate heart failure, serious but not immediately life-threatening. Yet death came so suddenly. He collapsed in his bedroom, no time to call for help. The doctor called it a massive heart attack, but why so fast? No prolonged chest pain, no clear warning signs. I read the records over and over, and the more I read, the less they added up. Something was missing, like a puzzle with a crucial piece removed. The more I recalled those small details, his haunted look, the question about betrayal, the unfinished sentences at dinner, the more convinced I became that his death wasn't a simple medical event. It felt like a mystery, something hidden. And now Victor's call, right after the funeral, felt like the final missing piece that suddenly brought every buried suspicion roaring to the surface. Why call at this exact moment? Why was his voice shaking? What danger was waiting for me? On the drive downtown, I kept checking the rearview mirror. Rain pattered steadily on the windshield, wipers beating in rhythm with my pulse. I had the distinct feeling I was being followed. Maybe that dark sedan a few cars back? Or was it just paranoia? My skin prickled. Someone watching me? Connected to Dad? A heavy, formless dread settled in my chest. Whatever waited at that meeting, it wasn't just about my father's death. It was the beginning of a chain of dangerous truths that could upend my entire life. I gripped the wheel tighter, took a deep breath, tried to stay calm. St. Louis slid past the windows, familiar streets now suddenly foreign and threatening. I thought about my younger brother, Scott, who hadn't even shown up to the funeral. Why? And why had Victor insisted repeatedly come alone? I parked in front of Victor's downtown building, rain still falling softly. My heart pounded as I rode the elevator to the 3rd floor. The office door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside, the air thick with foreboding, as if the room itself were warning me that nothing would ever be the same again. The sky had already turned dark. The neon lights from the hallway spilled into the office, casting long, distorted shadows that made everything look like a scene from an old film noir. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but the bad feeling clung to me like cold rain soaking through my suit. I was about to knock when the door suddenly opened from the inside. My heart nearly stopped. Standing there was a figure I knew all too well, Scott Wood, my younger brother. We almost collided, only inches apart in that unexpected moment. Scott, impeccably dressed in a tailored gray suit, hair perfectly combed, but his face was pale under the dim light. I froze, mouth open, unable to speak. What was he doing here? He hadn't shown up at Dad's funeral. Not a single call, not one word of condolence. I'd phoned him dozens of times, left worried voicemails, but he had vanished as if he'd dropped off the face of the earth. I stammered, my voice echoing in the empty hallway. Scott, what are you doing here? For a second he paused, his eyes sweeping over me, cold and indifferent, as if I were a stranger. No smile, no embrace, nothing. He simply glanced, then brushed past me without a word, heading straight for the elevator. The expensive scent of his cologne mixed with the musty smell of old documents from the office, leaving me even more stunned. I called after him, taking an instinctive step forward. Wait, I've been calling you all day and you never picked up. Why didn't you come to Dad's funeral? He's gone, Scott. Don't you even care? And what are you doing here, meeting the lawyer? Scott whipped around, eyes flashing with warning like a cornered animal. Mind your own business, Marcus, he hissed, voice low and venomous. And don't follow me. This doesn't concern you. The words weren't loud, but they cut like a blade. I saw his fist clench, knuckles white, as if he were holding something back. Then he turned and strode toward the elevator, the sharp click of his shoes on the marble floor sounding like a countdown. I stood rooted in the hallway, overwhelmed by confusion and shock. My pulse raced, thoughts spinning. Scott, my little brother, the kid I'd shared a childhood with, fought over toys with, laughed with beside our father, now looked at me like an enemy. Why had he skipped Dad's funeral? Dad lay there alone and Scott couldn't be bothered to say goodbye. Yet here he was, in the lawyer's office right after Victor's frantic call. Coincidence? Or something much darker? I turned back, pushed the door open again and stepped inside. Victor Haynes sat behind his desk, face drawn tight, hands trembling slightly around a coffee cup. He looked ashen, nothing like the confident, polished attorney I remembered, the man who had handled all of Dad's contracts and wills with an easy smile. Now he looked like someone running from his own shadow. The air in the room was suffocating, old paper, ink, and something that smelled suspiciously like fear. I knew instinctively that Scott's presence moments ago had not been random. It was another crooked piece in a puzzle that refused to fit. I sat down opposite him, forcing my voice to stay calm. Victor, why did you call me here so urgently? And Scott was just here, wasn't he? My brother. What did he want? Victor avoided my eyes, staring down at the papers on his desk. Marcus, thank you for coming so quickly. I I needed to verify some temporary powers of attorney and administrative documents your father, Alan, signed in his final days. His voice wavered as if he were reciting lines he didn't believe. I frowned, studying his face. Powers of attorney? You dragged me here from the cemetery, voice shaking, telling me my life was in danger and now it's just paperwork? He cleared his throat, fingers fumbling as he turned the pages. There were a few signatures executed very close to the time of Alan's passing. I need to cross-check everything to avoid future legal complications. As the eldest son, you're the logical person to... I cut him off, voice rising. What about the warning? You said my life might be in danger. Explain that. Victor looked flustered, eyes blinking rapidly, beads of sweat on his forehead despite the cool room. I was overly stressed at the time, Marcus. I exaggerated. It's just that after a death like Alan's, with an estate involved, sometimes heirs face disputes. I was only concerned for everyone's safety. The evasive answer, the shaking hands, the refusal to meet my gaze, everything screamed that he was hiding something. I wasn't getting any real information that matched the panic in his earlier call. No will, no secret, just routine paperwork. Who did he think he was fooling? Finally, I stood, gave him a cold goodbye, and left the office. Outside, night had fallen completely. The rain was heavier now, soaking my shoulders. My chest felt crushed under an invisible weight. A storm of questions raged in my head. Why had Scott been here at the exact moment Victor summoned me in such desperation? What business did he have with the lawyer? Why skip our father's funeral yet rush here for something urgent? And Victor, why the terror on the phone only to downplay everything in person? What was he afraid of? Scott? Or something bigger? Every detail connected into a tangled web of suspicion. My father's sudden death, the strange behavior of everyone around me, all of it pointed straight to Scott, my own brother, the person who used to be part of my blood and bones, now at the dark center of this nightmare. In the days following the meeting at the lawyer's office, I tried to slip back into my normal routine, pretending nothing had happened. Wake up early, brew strong black coffee, put on a crisp suit, drive downtown to the financial forensics firm in St. Louis. Same job as always, reviewing ledgers, dissecting reports, meeting clients greeted with a practiced professional smile. But inside my head, the scattered pieces kept gnawing relentlessly, like worms burrowing through my brain. Scott's icy stare in that dark hallway, Victor's terrified face and trembling hands, the frantic phone call from the cemetery warning that my life was in danger. Everything overlapped, tangled, forming a web I couldn't untangle. By day, I maintained an outward calm. I sat at my desk, fingers tapping steadily on the keyboard, tracing money trails for corporate clients. Colleagues asked gently, "Marcus, you holding up okay? After your dad's funeral and all?" I forced a smile. "I'm fine. It's over now. Thanks for asking." Yet the moment I left the office in the late afternoon or drove home through crowded streets, the feeling returned. Someone was watching every move I made. It was no longer a vague impression. It had become sharp, undeniable. I constantly checked the rearview mirror, heart racing whenever I spotted an unfamiliar pedestrian behind me, or a car that lingered a few yards back before suddenly turning away. "Who is it? Why are they following me?" Cold sweat broke out despite the air conditioning blasting at full power. At night, the sensation grew worse. I live in a quiet suburban apartment complex. Quiet, tree-lined, soft yellow streetlights. Now it felt sinister. I began noticing the same strange car, always dark gray or black, an ordinary-looking sedan parked a short distance from my building under the big oak tree. Headlights off, engine silent, but I could feel eyes on me from inside. The first time I thought it was a new neighbor. When I slowed and stared, the car suddenly started and glided away into the darkness. My stomach knotted. This isn't coincidence. I started taking different routes home, weaving through side streets, but the car still appeared, like a ghost that refused to let go. I tried to convince myself it was paranoia, grief-driven delusion. Then one morning, everything changed. I woke later than usual, exhausted after another sleepless night. Old habit. Turn on the TV for the morning news while making coffee. The anchor's calm voice ran through weather and traffic, then switched to breaking news. A massive fire broke out overnight in downtown St. Louis. The blaze started on the third floor of an office building, completely gutting several suites. At least one fatality has been confirmed. I was holding my coffee mug when the address flashed on screen. It took only seconds to recognize it, the exact building where Victor Haynes had his law office. Ice shot down my spine. The mug slipped from my hand and shattered on the floor, but I barely noticed. "No way," I whispered, eyes glued to the television. Smoke billowed black against the night sky, fire trucks flashing red, walls charred to ruin. I rushed out of the apartment, shirt half buttoned, breakfast and work forgotten, and sped toward downtown. Light rain fell, but my heart pounded like war drums. Victor, is he okay? Did something happen to him? When I arrived, the area was still cordoned off. The stench of smoke clawed at my throat. Curious onlookers shouted over the noise. The fire had only recently been contained. Water still dripped from hoses onto the wet pavement. I pushed through the crowd and felt my chest tighten when I saw a body bag on a stretcher being wheeled out, covered by white sheet. Whispers rippled around me. That's Lawyer Haynes, burned to death in his office. Police confirmed it moments later. Victor Haynes, dead, incinerated along with his office. Using my forensic examiner badge, I slipped closer. The room where he had received me was now only blackened walls, twisted furniture, files and computers reduced to ash. Nothing remained. No documents, no hard drives, no secrets. Police quickly sealed the scene and issued a preliminary finding. Accidental electrical fire overnight. Probably a short circuit from an old computer, an officer told me casually. But I knew with absolute certainty that it was no accident. Victor had been terrified. He had warned me. And now he was dead right after meeting Scott and me. I stood in the crowd, shock numbing every sound around me. Sirens shouting, everything muffled as if underwater. Victor, you knew something and now you're gone. Tears rolled down my face without my realizing it. I turned and walked away, steps heavy as though carrying the ashes of that burned room on my shoulders. On the drive home, I drove slowly, mind blank. Dad dead suddenly. Victor burned to death. Someone silencing witnesses. And Scott. He was in that office right before me. What does he know? After the fire, the feeling of being watched didn't fade. It grew sharper, more suffocating. It became a second skin, keeping every sense on high alert. I constantly felt invisible eyes on my back. When I spun around, no one was there. Walking from the car to my apartment, I sensed stares from across the street, from bushes along the path. I started checking everything. Strange fingerprints on windows. The front door still locked, yet the air inside felt different. A faint, unfamiliar scent of cologne or cigarette smoke. Some nights I came home to find the apartment door locked exactly as I'd left it, yet something felt violated. Papers on my desk had been shifted ever so slightly. Not enough to prove an intruder, but not quite how I'd left them either. I began photographing the apartment every day for comparison. Then came the silent phone calls, unknown numbers that rang once and hung up the moment I answered. The first time I thought it was a wrong number. By the third and fourth, I understood. Someone was checking whether I was home. Fear quietly eroded my nerves day by day. I slept poorly, jolted awake by the smallest sounds. Wind through the window crack, footsteps in the hallway, the refrigerator's hum. Deep inside, a cold certainty formed. Victor's death was no accident. It was another link broken in a chain I still couldn't fully see. Every earlier detail suddenly stood out in stark relief. The frantic call, his terrified eyes, the fire that happened far too conveniently. And then the chilling thought slid into my mind like a blade of ice. The next link in this silent, deadly chain might very well be me. After the fire that destroyed the lawyer's office, my life entered a new phase of instability, as though everything around me had been shrouded in a thick, menacing fog. I still went to work every day, reviewing financial records with an outwardly calm face, but inside I was a ticking bomb waiting to explode. And from that point on, Scott began showing up beside me with unnatural frequency, like a ghost that had suddenly decided to play the role of an overly attentive brother. The first time he visited was only a few days after the fire. I was sitting in my apartment, staring blankly at the television while images of Victor's sheet-covered body still haunted me. The doorbell rang. I flinched, instinctively gripping the remote. I looked through the peephole, Scott wearing a forced smile, holding a takeout bag. "Marcus, open up. I came to check on you," he called, his voice sounding normal, but to me every word from him now felt suspicious. I opened the door and tried to keep my tone even. "Scott, what are you doing here?" He stepped inside, set the bag on the kitchen counter. The smell of fast food, hamburgers and fries from the diner we loved as kids filled the air. "Have you eaten?" "I brought food. I wanted to see how you're holding up after Dad." On the surface, it was brotherly concern after a tragedy, but I could feel it. In his eyes and the way he phrased every question, there was something probing, monitoring my smallest reaction. He asked things like, "You doing okay? How's work? Sleeping all right?" While his gaze swept the room, lingering on my desk where I kept a few personal files. I nodded, sat on the sofa trying not to betray my suspicion. "Dad's death. I'm getting there. Thanks for checking in." We ate mechanically, talked about the weather, about St. Louis's rainy season, yet I noticed how he silently studied my apartment for long moments, noting every detail on my desk and shelves, as if searching for something invisible. "You still keep Dad's old ledgers?" he asked casually. I shook my head. "No, just my work stuff." He nodded, but I could tell he was memorizing the placement of everything. After that, he came by every few days, once with a bottle of red wine, to help you unwind after a long day. Another time with a box of pastries from the old bakery Dad used to love. "I remember Dad always bought these," he said, voice dropping, but I didn't believe the sadness was genuine. Each visit lasted a little longer. He asked about my life. "Met anyone strange lately? Getting any weird calls?" I answered briefly, pulse quickening. Was he testing whether I suspected anything? Waiting for me to reveal curiosity about the fire? During what seemed like casual conversation, Scott began steering talk toward Dad's estate. One evening over wine at the kitchen table, he sighed. "Dad left so suddenly, huh? No time for proper farewells or even an official will. Such a shame." His tone was regretful, but his eyes stayed sharp. Then he made his move. "We should settle the inheritance soon, just the two of us, to avoid legal headaches later. What do you think?" I took a sip, staying calm. "Cut to the chase, Scott. No need to dance around it." He proposed keeping full control of the logistics company Dad had handed over to him 6 years earlier when Alan retired. "It only makes sense, Marcus. I've run every aspect of it for years. I know every contract, every employee. Handing it to someone else would be chaos. The rest, the family home, a few small properties outside town, the savings accounts, he said I could decide freely. Sell or keep, I don't care. I just want the company. It's in my blood now." I didn't argue. Money and property meant nothing to me right then. They were meaningless next to the grief and the questions eating me alive. "Fine," I said indifferently. "Do whatever paperwork you need." I didn't ask for details, didn't request records or legal documents. My indifference clearly surprised him for a split second. His eyes flickered as if recalculating. But then he looked relieved, almost satisfied, as though a weight had lifted. "Great. I'll take care of everything with the company. You don't have to worry about a thing." The conversation ended quickly. He left soon after, leaving me with a full glass of wine and cold food. Alone again, I sat in silence for a long time. Not because I regretted the assets, I'd never intended to fight Scott over money, but because one question hammered inside my skull. Why was Scott in such a desperate hurry to settle everything? He was so quick to declare Dad had left no will, so eager to divide the estate right after the lawyer's office burned to the ground. Victor dead, files destroyed, Scott rushing to tidy everything up. Was he afraid something would surface? Had Dad actually left a will, or evidence tied to his death? The suspicion grew deeper, a widening crack in glass. I remembered our childhood. Scott had always been the spoiled younger son, the one Dad forgave everything. Scott's still little, Dad used to say. But perhaps that indulgence had turned into something far darker. After that conversation, Scott kept visiting, but now he spent more time quietly watching my reactions than talking. Once he sat silently, eyes sliding over my bookshelves, pausing at Dad's old notebooks I'd kept. "Still reading Dad's old journals?" he asked lightly. I shrugged, stayed nonchalant, asked if he wanted coffee, and turned away to hide the suspicion in my eyes. Outwardly, I remained indifferent, never asking questions, never bringing up the estate again, acting as if everything were already forgotten. But inside, the calm facade did nothing to quiet the growing certainty that this silence was only the hush before a much larger wave, one that was gathering strength somewhere just out of sight. 2 years passed in silence, like a slow-motion film in which I was the reluctant protagonist. The sensations that once tormented me, the strange car parked outside, the silent hang-up calls, the furniture shifted just a centimeter, gradually faded with time. At first I still jumped at every odd noise, still checked my rearview mirror obsessively, but life swept me along. Work at the forensic accounting firm grew busier, endless reports demanding clients. They filled my days and left little room for paranoia. Scott's visits also dwindled, from every few days to every few weeks, then stopped almost completely. The last time he came over more than 6 months ago, he stayed only a short while, asked vague questions about my job, then left with a strained smile. "Take care of yourself, Marcus," he said, but the warmth was gone. I nodded, closed the door, and exhaled, not from relief, but from no longer having to perform the charade of normalcy. On the surface, life returned to ordinary. Morning runs around the neighborhood, lunchtime sandwiches at the usual deli near the office, evenings spent reading or watching old movies. St. Louis remained the same. Gray streets under drizzling rain, skyscrapers reflecting neon at night. Yet deep inside, the questions about Dad's death and Victor's fire still smoldered in a hidden corner of my mind, like an old scar that aches in bad weather. I no longer dug, no longer called the police, no longer followed Scott, but the questions remained. Why did Dad's sudden death? Why did Victor and every document burn? And Scott, was he involved? I pushed them down, but they resurfaced on sleepless nights when I lay staring at the ceiling, listening to rain tapping the window. Then one day, in the middle of a mountain of financial reports at the office, my phone vibrated. An international number. I answered professionally. Marcus Wood speaking. A brief silence, then a low, weary woman's voice. "Marcus, it's Mom." My heart clenched. Paula Wood, my mother, had divorced Dad when I was 23 and moved to France with her new husband. We exchanged only a few polite emails a year, nothing deep. Her voice sounded exhausted, as if it had crossed the entire Atlantic carrying its own weight. "Why are you calling, Mom? Are you all right? You sound tired." She sighed softly. "I'm in the States, Marcus. I flew in yesterday. We need to meet as soon as possible. There's something very important I can only tell you in person." I straightened in my chair, gripping the phone. "What is it? Is something wrong?" A pause. "Not over the phone. There's a little cafe near the Central Park today at 3 p.m. And come alone. Don't tell Scott." Those words froze me. Come alone. Don't tell Scott. Exactly like Victor's panicked call from the cemetery 2 years ago. "Mom, why? Scott's your son too." "Just come alone, Marcus. I'll be waiting." The call ended, leaving a storm of questions swirling in my head. I glanced at the clock. 2 hours left. Work lay unfinished, but I couldn't focus. I made an excuse about a family emergency, left the office early, and drove through St. Louis' crowded streets. We met in a quiet corner cafe, the air thick with the smell of roasted coffee and soft jazz. I spotted her at a back table, hands wrapped around a cup of tea. Paula looked much older than I remembered, hair threaded with silver, face lined, eyes carrying years of fatigue and guilt. I called softly, sat across from her. She looked up, gave a weak smile, eyes already red. "Marcus, my boy, it's been so long. You've grown so much." We hugged awkwardly, the first embrace in years. After a few polite questions, "How's life in France? How's your husband?" She shook her head. "This isn't the time for small talk." She reached into her bag and pulled out a thick folder carefully wrapped in brown craft paper, placing it in front of me. Her hands trembled as if afraid someone might see. "This is everything your father sent me shortly before he died. He told me to give it to you only when the truth could no longer stay hidden." My heart pounded as I opened the folder. Page after page of documents, illegal financial statements, off-the-books contracts, bank records of hidden transactions, all bearing clear traces of Scott's involvement. His signatures, transfers from the logistics company to offshore, forged invoices inflating expenses. I flipped faster, throat dry. What is all this, Mom? Scott? Did he really do this?" Paula's voice broke. Tears rolled down her cheeks. "I've kept these papers all this time because I didn't have the courage to face the fact that my own son committed crimes. Your father discovered it and sent them to me as a last safeguard." She confessed she had wrestled for years between a mother's love and her conscience, between protecting her child and allowing crimes to continue. "I didn't want to believe it, Marcus. Scott was the baby. I always thought he just made mistakes. But these numbers, money laundering, systematic fraud..." Her voice cracked. She admitted that she and Dad had always shielded Scott too much, thinking it was love, never imagining it would plant the seeds of something so twisted. "We forgave him everything. The first time he stole pocket money went missing. The first fight at school, we said, he's just a kid. But he grew up believing he could do anything without consequences. When your father handed him the company, Scott turned it into a tool for evil." I sat silent, stroking the folder, childhood memories flooding back. Scott always the favored one, me the older brother expected to yield. "Scott's still fragile," Dad used to say. "Fragile enough to commit crimes?" Only when her own health failed, she told me she'd had a heart attack the previous year. And the guilt became unbearable, did she find the courage to fly back and hand me the evidence. "I don't have much time left, Marcus," she whispered, voice shaking. "I won't take this secret to my grave. Your father, he carried it alone for too long." Before leaving, Paula pulled a sealed envelope from her bag and pressed it into my hand. "Your father left this for you. Read it, and then decide for yourself whether to turn everything over to the authorities. I can't make that choice for you because Scott is my son too." She stood, hugged me tightly, quickly, tearfully, then turned and walked out. Her figure disappeared into the crowd. I remained alone at the table, the thick folder and sealed letter in front of me. The coffee in my cup had long gone cold, its bitterness spreading across my tongue, exactly like the feeling flooding my chest. In that moment, I understood clearly. The quiet life I thought I had regained had only been a fragile calm before the real storm of truth. I left the cafe, drove home in a daze, the folder heavy on the passenger seat. 2 years I thought it was over. Now everything was exploding again. I carried the thick folder and the sealed letter home in a state of crushing heaviness, as though I were cradling a piece of truth I wasn't yet ready to face fully. My apartment, once a quiet refuge of old books and a worn-out sofa, now felt alien. I triple-locked the door, drew every curtain tight, as if someone might be watching from the dark windows. The dim yellow light from the desk lamp spilled across the wooden floor, casting long, distorted shadows that made the silence suffocating. I placed the folder on the kitchen table and stared at it for a long time, heart pounding. The sealed envelope lay on top. I told myself to open it, but my hands hesitated, afraid that tearing it would unleash a monster. Finally, after sitting motionless for what felt like hours, I took a deep breath, ripped the envelope, and began to read. Each line felt like a slow knife sliding into my mind, the pain so sharp I had to stop halfway, throat burning. In the letter, Dad confessed he had discovered Scott's criminal activities years earlier. It had started with small discrepancies and grown into an entire network of money laundering, secret contracts, and illicit cash flows. My son, I saw the first signs 6 years ago when Scott took over the company. Unusual expenses, forged invoices. I thought they were mistakes at first, but they kept piling up. Scott turned the logistics firm into a machine for cleaning dirty money. Shell contracts, ghost partners, millions of dollars funneled through it. My hands shook as I read, picturing Dad alone in his study under a dim lamp, face pale as the horrifying truth dawned on him. He wrote that he had wrestled for years between a father's love and the duty of a law-abiding man, tormented every night by his inability to denounce his own son. I lay awake so many nights, Marcus. How could I turn in my own boy? But staying silent. Silence became its own crime. And the longer I stayed silent, the greater Scott's crimes grew. I regret it more than anything. Dad admitted that their lifelong indulgence, his and Mom's, had convinced Scott he could cross any line without consequence. Your mother and we were wrong from the start. From the time he was little, Scott was forgiven everything, shielded every time he did wrong. We thought it was love. But that blind protection fed his selfishness and the belief that he stood above the rules. He came to think the law couldn't touch him, that money could buy anything. I paused, tears streaming. Memories flooded back. Scott stealing loose change from Dad's wallet, caught red-handed yet only lightly scolded. He's still little, Dad would say. I, the older brother, always had to yield. And now, that indulgence had created a monster. Dad confessed that once Scott began to suspect he knew the truth, Dad realized his own days were numbered. Scott started looking at me differently, son. Probing glances, roundabout questions. I knew he would do anything to protect his secret. I couldn't finish the thought. My heart turned to ice. Dad feared he would be killed. By Scott, by my own brother. That was why Alan had secretly copied every piece of evidence and sent it to the two people he trusted most. Mom and Victor. As insurance that the truth would survive if anything happened to him. I only sent it to your mother and to Victor because it was the only way to be sure that if something happened to me, the truth would still exist. And you would stay safe. As long as you didn't know anything yet. He hadn't dared give it to me directly, terrified I would become the next target, and because he never wanted to burden me with something so cruel. I didn't want you involved, Marcus. You're the honest one, the clean one. I was afraid Scott would come after you if you knew. I only wanted you to live in peace. But he also knew that sooner or later I would have to learn the truth, and that he could no longer prevent it. The truth always finds a way out, son. I knew your mother would bring it to you when the time was right. I only hope you are strong enough. He wrote that he had always been proud of me, of my integrity, my choice to live cleanly, so different from the path Scott had taken. You are my pride, Marcus. You chose forensic accounting and kept your honor. Scott, he chose darkness. I'm proud of you, but I ache because I couldn't save your brother. That was why he apologized for leaving me with an impossible choice. Stay silent and preserve what little remained of the family, or speak the truth and face the dangers he himself had lacked the courage to confront. I'm sorry for putting you at this crossroads. Silence means keeping the family together, but your conscience will suffer. Speaking out means justice, but danger. I wasn't brave enough to choose, so I leave the decision to you. He didn't demand that I punish Scott for him or defend his own honor. He only asked that I live true to my own conscience, no matter how painful. Don't do it for me. Do it for yourself, for what you believe is right. No matter how much it hurts, stay true to who you are. In the final lines, he repeatedly urged me to put my own safety first, because he had lost the power to protect me the moment he realized Scott was capable of anything to hide his crimes. Be careful, son. Scott, your brother, is more dangerous than I ever imagined. Protect yourself first. The letter ended with a late, heartbroken apology from a father who had failed to save one son and had now thrust the other into hell. I'm sorry, Marcus. I failed with Scott, and now I'm dragging you into the abyss. I love you. I folded the letter, sat motionless for a long time, throat choked, chest crushed by pain and rage intertwined. Tears fell onto the paper, blurring the ink. For the first time, I fully understood the loneliness and helplessness Dad had endured in his final years. Alone with the secret torn inside, fearing for his life, yet still trying to shield me. The evidence in the folder, combined with the letter, left no doubt. Scott had been committing systematic, large-scale crimes for years. Millions laundered through the company, fake contracts, ghost partners that existed only on paper, all under his direction. I leafed through the pages again, reading carefully, heart slicing open with every line. And in that same moment, a cold, clear thought crystallized. Scott was very likely the one who killed Dad, and who arranged the fire that took Victor's life. Dad's death had been too sudden, too inconsistent with his medical records. Victor's office burned just when he held the evidence, and the official cause was listed as an electrical fault. Everything had fallen too perfectly for someone desperate to silence witnesses. Scott had met Victor right before me. Then Victor died. Then Scott rushed to settle the estate. All the pieces snapped together. The realization hit me like being dragged out of the world I thought was family and into a nightmare. I stood, staggered around the room, clutching my chest. Childhood memories shattered, Scott grinning on his birthday, Dad hugging us both. Now, a criminal, a murderer. In the dark, silent apartment for the first time in 2 years, I was no longer merely the suspicious brother. I had become the man holding proof that could destroy everything. After reading Dad's letter and facing the full truth inside that folder, I spent many nearly sleepless nights torn between family loyalty, conscience, and the duty of a citizen before the law. I lay in bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling while my mind spun with endless questions. Scott is my own brother, I told myself, picturing him in handcuffs, dragged off to prison. But then Dad's image appeared, alone in his final years, carrying that crushing secret, dying in pain and fear. If I stay silent, how am I any different from him? From Mom, who spoiled Scott until she became an accomplice to his crimes. My conscience gnawed at me every second, like a blade twisting deeper. I thought of Victor, burned alive, his files reduced to ash. If I hesitated, this folder could disappear too, and justice would be buried forever. On those nights, I would get up, pace the room, pick up the letter, and read it again, tears streaming. Dad, why did you leave this burden to me? I whispered, voice breaking in the darkness. Finally, after weeks of torment and sleeplessness, I understood that silence was no longer an option. If I kept hesitating, Scott might find and destroy the evidence. I could not let that happen again. One early morning, as the first sunlight slipped through the curtains, I decided to change everything before it was too late. I sat at the computer and backed up every document, scanned every page, copied everything onto encrypted USB drives, uploaded it all to a secure cloud with complex passwords. My hands shook as I sealed the original papers inside a lockbox. I put on my coat, carried the box to the car, and drove straight to the FBI field office in downtown St. Louis. On the way, I kept checking the mirrors, terrified someone was following, but there was only the usual morning traffic. I took a deep breath, walked into the cold glass building, showed my ID, and asked to speak with an agent. I have evidence of money laundering and large-scale financial fraud. I said, voice steady but burning inside. They led me to a secure room and I handed over the entire evidence to federal authorities. The moment the box left my hands, it felt as if I had dropped a crushing weight and at the same time opened the gates of hell. The investigation began immediately, multiple independent teams working to prevent leaks. I was told only, "We'll take it from here, Mr. Wood. Please keep this confidential." I went home and waited, heart pounding. For the first few days, nothing visible happened. Life looked normal on the surface, but I knew the wheels of justice had started turning. FBI financial specialists cross-checked bank records, tracing every illicit dollar through layers of shell accounts, both domestic and offshore. I imagined them at their screens following the money trail. Transfers from Scott's logistics company to Cayman banks, then back into the U.S. through dummy subsidiaries. "This is a professional network," one agent later told me over the phone, voice calm. Shell companies were peeled away, businesses that existed only on paper to hide transactions. Unaudited logistics contracts were seized and dissected, hundreds of pages, forged signatures, backdated documents. Entire phantom shipments, containers recorded as full but never existed, transportation costs inflated double, invoices systematically falsified for years. Encrypted updates arrived. "We've found traces going back to 2018 when Scott took over the company." My chest tightened. 6 years building an empire of crime right under Dad's roof. Accountants, warehouse managers, and middlemen were summoned one by one. At first, they denied everything, statements contradictory. "I didn't know anything," one accountant stammered, voice shaking. But as the financial evidence mounted, bank records, internal emails, even warehouse surveillance footage, the pieces locked together. One warehouse manager finally confessed, "Scott ordered us to log fake shipments to hide the money." I followed it all from a distance through brief calls from the agent, feeling as if I were watching a crime drama whose villain was my own brother. Scott's company was placed under special oversight. Major transactions were frozen by court order. Employees panicked. Phones rang nonstop from partners. Information began to leak, perhaps from a frightened staff member or journalist sniffing blood. The first newspaper articles appeared. St. Louis logistics firm investigated for massive money laundering scheme. Shareholders and partners panicked. Contracts were suspended pending results. The company's value, though privately held, collapsed in internal dealings. Not long afterwards, Scott was arrested on suspicion of large-scale money laundering and financial fraud. I was at my office when the text came from the agent. "Evidence is nearly complete. Your brother has been taken into custody for questioning." I turned on the television. There he was on every news channel. Scott in his gray suit, hands cuffed, head down, flanked by agents as cameras flashed. "Scott Wood, CEO of local logistics company, arrested on suspicion of money laundering." I sank into my chair, hand over my mouth. No triumph, no satisfaction, only an immense emptiness. For a split second, he glanced at the cameras, eyes wild like a trapped animal. I watched from afar, feeling none of the relief I once imagined. I had pictured this moment for weeks. Scott arrested, justice served, and I would finally breathe. But there was no release. Justice wasn't a burst of victory, it was a slow, cold, unstoppable machine. I sat alone in my apartment, news looping on the screen, thinking of Dad. Justice is merciless, like a millstone that grinds everything to dust. I understood that from this point forward, nothing belonged to our family anymore. It belonged to the cold machinery of the law, FBI, courts, prosecutors. They would decide Scott's fate, not me. I had only started the process, now I was merely a spectator. I knew the road ahead would be neither short nor painless. Once the truth was dragged into the light, it would sweep away countless consequences no one could escape. My family, Dad's honor, the quiet life I had rebuilt, everything could collapse. But I also knew that from this moment on, I no longer had the right to turn back. The truth was here, staring me in the face, and I was the only one left who could walk the rest of the way with it. The trial for Scott Wood's financial crimes took place after many months of investigation, drawing intense attention from the media, the business community, and the local public. The federal courthouse in downtown St. Louis became the center of the storm. Television vans lined the street, reporters jostled with cameras and microphones, and suited businessmen whispered in the corridors. "Biggest money laundering case in the city this year," one headline read. I read it with a heavy heart. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, lawyers, shareholders who had lost money to the fake contracts, and everyone connected to Scott's logistics empire. I attended as the sole key witness, the person who had personally delivered the original evidence to the authorities. Mom was there too, sitting quietly in the gallery. The prosecutor called me to the stand first, right after the opening statements. I walked forward, legs like lead, gripping the polished wooden rail. The room fell silent except for the click of camera shutters and faint murmurs. I swore the oath, voice trembling. "I will tell the truth, the whole truth." When Scott was brought in, his eyes locked onto mine instantly, not with remorse, but with an icy, chilling hatred that made my blood run cold. He sat at the defense table in a light gray suit, hair perfectly combed, but his face was gaunt after months in pretrial detention. Those eyes, sharp as knives, filled with pure loathing, made me falter for a moment. Not the eyes of a brother, but of an enemy. I remembered childhood, Scott looking up at me with admiration when I taught him to kick a soccer ball. Now, only hatred. Throughout the questioning, Scott remained cold, denying personal responsibility until the layers of financial evidence were presented in open court. His defense attorney, a tall man with a booming voice, argued, "My client was merely a victim of faulty accounting systems. There is no direct proof." But then the prosecutor displayed slide after slide on the large screen, red numbers glaring, bank statements, forged contracts, offshore transfers. "This is Mr. Wood's signature," the prosecutor said, pointing. Scott sat motionless, expression unchanged, but I saw his hands clench beneath the table. Faced with irrefutable, undeniable evidence, every defense argument crumbled. Other witnesses took the stand, a former company accountant, voice shaking. "Scott ordered us to create fake invoices to hide the money." Scott showed no remorse, only stared at me with eyes overflowing with hatred, as if I were the sole cause of his downfall. Every time I testified, recounting Dad's folder and the letter, he stared, eyes boring into me like daggers. After deliberation, the jury delivered the verdict. Scott Wood was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison for organized money laundering, large-scale financial fraud, and systematic falsification of accounting records. On sentencing day, the courtroom was deathly quiet, only the sound of ragged breathing. The judge, a middle-aged woman with a stern voice, read, "Defendant Scott Wood is sentenced to 18 years imprisonment with no possibility of parole." All illegally obtained assets were seized for restitution and legal processing. Luxury cars, the mansion, bank accounts, everything frozen. When the sentence was pronounced, the room buzzed. Reporters scribbled furiously. Affected shareholders clapped softly. Mom covered her mouth and wept. Scott staggered back as if drained of strength, face ashen but still showed no remorse. He stood straight, staring at the judge, head unbowed, no apology. Federal marshals approached, handcuffed him again, and led him out through the center aisle under the eyes of the public and the press. Cameras flashed nonstop. Reporters shouted, "Scott, any regrets?" He walked in silence, steps steady but eyes red-rimmed. Just before disappearing through the door, Scott turned and looked at me one last time. That gaze held no fear, only hatred compressed to its breaking point, as if to say, "This is all because of you." I stood frozen, heart aching. That was my little brother, the boy who once shared everything with me. I remained in place, watching his figure vanish behind the courtroom doors. No sense of victory, no relief as I had once imagined. I had thought that when he was sentenced, I would finally breathe freely, that justice would feel like release. But there was only a vast, cold emptiness in my chest where a family used to be. Mom hugged me. "It's over, son. You did what neither your father nor I had the courage to do. But it wasn't over. I looked around the emptying courtroom, the fading murmurs. For me, everything was only beginning. The fallout would come. Media digging, friends pulling away, Scott in prison for 18 years. Would he ever change? Or would the hatred only grow? I walked out of the courthouse into the blinding midday sun. The noise of the city rushed back as if nothing had changed, yet my private world had been altered forever. The light stung my eyes. I squinted and walked slowly along the crowded sidewalk. Cars roared, pedestrians hurried, a nearby cafe rang with laughter. But for me, the world was different now. No longer a perfect family, only broken pieces. I drove Mom home. She was silent the entire way, clutching her purse as if it were the last fragment of peace she had left. "Marcus, what are you going to do now?" she asked softly as we entered the house. I shook my head. I didn't know. The trial was over, Scott sentenced to 18 years, but the pain didn't end. It spread like an open wound that kept bleeding day after day. For weeks afterward, the media wouldn't let go. Scott's cuffed image replayed endlessly on television, public opinion buzzing. I avoided everything, turned off the phone, locked the door, but the trial haunted me. His hate-filled stare, the gavel's echo like a hammer blow. I had done the right thing, yet why did my heart feel so heavy? Mom flew back to France a few days later, hugging me tightly at the airport. "Forgive yourself, son." Forgive? I still couldn't forgive anyone, not even myself. Not long after the sentencing, I arranged a prison visit. My stomach knotted with both dread and the need to face him. My hands shook as I signed in, passed through the metal detector, told the guard in a hoarse voice, "I'm here to see inmate Scott Wood." He nodded and led me to the visitation room. Cold concrete walls, hard plastic chairs, the sharp smell of disinfectant. I sat staring at the clock ticking, heart drumming. When Scott was brought in, the orange jumpsuit made his rapid decline unmistakable. Gaunt face, unkempt beard, body thinner than before. But the eyes were unchanged, cold, razor-sharp, unbroken, like a caged predator still ready to strike. He sat on the other side of the thick glass, picked up the receiver, and stared at me. Two brothers separated by bulletproof glass, silence stretching long and heavy before either spoke. The room felt suffocating, whispers from other inmates, the loudspeaker calling names, but between us there was only silence. I searched his face for any trace of the little brother I once knew, the kid who cried when he lost a game, who grinned ear to ear when Dad praised him. Nothing remained, only a stranger filled with hatred. I spoke first, voice low and deliberate, forcing out words I had held back too long. "Scott, so was it all you? Not just the money laundering, the fraud, but Dad's death too? And Victor's?" The question fell like a stone into an abyss. I stared straight into his eyes, waiting for denial, rage, anything. Scott looked back for a long moment, then gave a dry, humorless laugh through the receiver. "Yes, big brother. It was all me. Dad and that lawyer Victor, they knew too much. I had to clean house." He admitted everything with terrifying calm, as if discussing the weather. No remorse, no tremor, just icy detachment, as though murder were simply business. I sat frozen as the worst suspicions were confirmed, my heart plunging. "You killed Dad? You're a monster." My voice broke, hands gripping the phone until my knuckles went white. The image of Dad collapsing in his bedroom, the medical file that never quite added up. Now, it was crystal clear. Scott nodded, eyes unblinking. "Dad found out. He was going to turn me in. I couldn't let that happen. A simple overdose made to look like a heart attack. Same with Victor. An accidental fire." He spoke lightly, like describing a grocery run. I reeled, tears falling unnoticed. "Why? He was the man who gave you life." Scott didn't answer immediately. His gaze darkened as if digging into memory, then coldly, "Anyone who stands in my way pays the price, even the man who gave me life. Survival of the fittest, big brother." A pause. Then he added almost casually, that he had once planned to kill me too because I was the only one capable of tracing the money trails. I considered you. You're a forensic examiner. You could have uncovered it. I had you followed after Dad's funeral, waiting for a slip. He gave that thin smile. Those strange cars, the silent calls, that was me. One wrong move and you'd have been next. Ice flooded my veins. My own brother had stalked me, ready to murder me. But you didn't care, he continued, voice tinged with regret. You stayed indifferent, uninterested in the estate, the company. I thought you were harmless. That was the biggest mistake of my life. My very apathy had convinced him I was no threat, and that apathy was why he was now paying the price. I looked at him for a long time, no longer as a brother but as a stranger stripped bare. I spoke slowly, calmly, painfully. Mom and Dad were wrong, Scott. They shielded you too much, forgave too easily, cleaned up every mess you made. They thought it was love, but that blind protection taught you that you stood above everything, that money could erase any sin, that a human life was just another obstacle to remove. Then quietly, like a final blade to whatever conscience might remain. Remember this clearly, Scott. Every person who ever sacrificed for you, who ever sinned to protect you, live with that memory inside those four walls every single day for the rest of your life. For the first time, Scott faltered. His eyes wavered. The hatred flickered, as if something had struck him. He opened his mouth, said nothing, and then a single tear slid down his hardened face, quick but unmistakable. That brief moment. Was it remorse? Or just a flash of weakness? He said no more. The guard signaled time. Scott stood, turned away, and was led back through the heavy iron door, the lock clanging shut like the lid of a coffin. I remained seated a few seconds longer, heart sinking with the feeling that something irreversible had just ended. The room's oppressive air, the loudspeaker calling other names, everything faded. When I walked out of the prison, there was no burning hatred, no relief, only the cold sorrow of a family shattered beyond repair. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the concrete yard. The wind carried the stale smell of confinement. And so the prison visit ended in pain that reached the marrow. I drove away as the sky turned to dusk, the last rays of sunlight sliding across the city, now lighting its evening lamps. The city kept moving, loud and indifferent, unaware that a world inside me had collapsed forever. Life goes on, but from that moment I knew with certainty, for me everything had changed irrevocably. After that final prison visit, I decided to leave the city that held too many painful memories. St. Louis, the city where I was born, grew up, watched my father die, and saw my brother fall into ruin, had become an invisible prison, trapping me in memories I could never erase. I couldn't stay any longer. Every street corner reminded me of something. The cemetery where Dad lay, the burned-out lawyer's office, the apartment where Scott once visited with his fake smile. I requested a transfer to another branch of the company in Chicago, a bigger, stranger city where I could start over in a completely new environment. My boss approved immediately. He must have seen the exhaustion on my face. "You need a change of scenery," he said, clapping my shoulder. I nodded, feeling a slight relief but also anxiety. Leaving meant abandoning everything. The few friends I had, familiar routines, and Dad's grave. But I needed the distance to breathe. The old apartment sold quickly through a real estate agency. I stood watching the broker show strangers around, heart tightening. Those walls had witnessed too much. Sleepless nights after Dad's funeral. The silent phone calls, the folder from Mom. I packed my belongings on a rainy afternoon, boxing everything up, hands trembling when I touched objects tied to the past. I kept only a few small mementos of Dad, memories too precious to discard. An old family photo, the watch he wore every day, and the notebook with his shaky handwriting. These are all that remain of a shattered family, I thought, packing them carefully into my suitcase. When I locked the door for the last time, I turned back to look at the empty rooms, tears rolling down. "Goodbye," I whispered, as if speaking to the past itself. In Chicago, a new life began with small but meaningful changes. I bought a modest apartment overlooking Lake Michigan. The cool breeze and sound of waves helped me sleep better than I ever had in St. Louis. My forensic accounting work continued, but I chose to focus on transparent cases, ones that protected the innocent, a quiet way of atoning for my family's losses. I stayed away from complex fraud investigations. Instead, I reviewed nonprofit reports and helped small businesses avoid financial mistakes. Every day, analyzing numbers at my desk, I thought of Dad, how proud he had been of my honesty. Work became an anchor, letting me forget a little, while also reminding me how money can destroy a person. My life grew simpler, fewer social obligations, more time alone, more silence to heal. I avoided parties, met colleagues only for occasional coffee, talking shop, never personal matters. Weekends, I jogged along the lakefront, cold winds slapping my face, clearing my mind. I no longer ran from memories. I faced them in those quiet moments, cried when I needed to, reflected when it hurt. Mom called every week from France. We talked about the weather, health, never Scott. "How are you, son?" she'd ask, eyes red on the screen. "I'm okay, Mom," I'd answer, even though the emptiness remained. Occasionally, I received sparse updates about Scott through legal channels or prison notifications. An email from the lawyer saying his appeal failed or that he'd been transferred. I didn't dig deeper, just accepted it as an unchangeable fact. "He's quieter now, but healthy," the lawyer said once over the phone. I nodded and hung up. I never visited again. That last meeting had been enough. I wondered about him in there. Reading? Learning a trade? Nursing hatred? I didn't know, and I no longer wanted to. It let me live without being dragged backward. On quiet nights, I often sat alone, looking back over the entire journey, from the days we were a whole family, to the moment the truth surfaced and everything collapsed. By the window, watching Lake Michigan shimmer under moonlight, I remembered childhood. Dad teaching us to fish, Mom laughing while cooking dinner. Simple happiness, I thought, tears falling. Then Dad's funeral, the fire, Mom's folder, the trial, everything like a slow film. I realized the tragedy didn't begin with the crimes, it began with silence, with covering up, with choices made in the name of love that only fed the wrong. Dad stayed silent out of love for Scott. Mom hid the evidence out of maternal instinct. The result? Death and ruin. "Silence is complicity," I whispered, chest aching. From my family's story, I learned that blind indulgence is not love. Sometimes it is simply enabling evil to grow day by day. Scott grew up believing he was untouchable, and the result was that he killed our father, killed Victor. I also learned that speaking the truth is always painful, but staying silent in the face of wrong leaves far heavier consequences. I chose to speak even though it cost me my brother, I thought, feeling a measure of peace. I accepted that some losses can never be repaired, yet a person must keep living, keep walking forward with honesty and clarity. Dad gone, Scott in prison, Mom far away, but I was still here, still had my conscience. When I rarely shared my story with someone close, a trusted colleague or new acquaintance, I always emphasized one thing: never let love become an excuse for covering up wrong. Loving your child doesn't mean hiding their mistakes, I would say, voice low. Teach them boundaries and consequences before you teach them success or money. Teach them responsibility before wealth. And if one day you must face the most painful truth inside your own family, have the courage to choose what is right, no matter how high the price. One afternoon, standing quietly before Dad's grave on a rare trip back to my hometown, I felt no more resentment, only a calm understanding of the torment he had carried to the end. I had flown back to St. Louis for the first time since moving, drove to the cemetery under a crisp autumn sky. Dad's stone stood unchanged, Allen wood engraved in granite, grass growing thick and green. I knelt, whispered in my heart that I had walked the hardest road for both him and Mom. "Dad, I did what you and Mom couldn't. Our family is broken, but you and Mom are still in my heart." The wind stirred, carrying the scent of damp earth, as if Dad were answering. I sat there a long while, telling him about my new life, about Mom, about Scott. No anger, only understanding. Dad had suffered because he stayed silent, yet he had tried to protect me. When I left the cemetery, I walked slowly between the rows of trees, the last sunlight fading. The breeze moved gently, bringing the familiar smell of earth and quiet. Behind me lay a past full of loss, pain, and irreparable mistakes. But from that place I felt I had finally closed the heaviest chapter, opening a different path, one where I no longer had to hide from the truth, no longer lived in torment but could walk with my head high, true to my own conscience. And from that day on, I chose a quieter life. I no longer fled memories, no longer let resentment gnaw at my soul. I learned to accept what cannot be changed and to cherish what still lies ahead. Everything that happened became a lesson carved deep inside me. Every choice we make today, no matter how small, silently shapes the fate of tomorrow.